All right, well, we're going to go ahead and begin. So here's the Western Wall. We're just doing a little introduction to the Middle East and specifically to Jerusalem. So that's the women's section. There's actually a walled off women, or well, you can see the wall, but that's where the women get to do their prayers and they have a gathering spot for them. And men are not supposed to go there. This is one of the tunnels of Hezekiah. So you have Hezekiah's tunnels, which go back into the mountain or alongside the Western Wall. Where these men are is actually the wall. And I don't have any pictures. Nope. So this gentleman here would be an older Rebbe from his dress. These would be students more than likely. That's looking out. So where those two gentlemen are walking out toward where the men's section is. And then, again, I still didn't manage to get any pictures. So there's like 3 or 4 different access points that are covered with plexiglass and padlocked that if you're really, really lucky, you get to crawl down the ladder. And this wall continues down for about maybe 50 feet, maybe 60 feet. And at the bottom of the ladders are the largest moved cut stones in the world. So when King Herod, he decided the Temple Mount was not big enough. So he built literally a wall around it and backfilled and then leveled it out and then built the porticos and the end pieces on the southern side. So, of course, with the destruction, all that's left of that original building is this wall, okay? So this is the newly remodeled women's section. When I first started going there in '97, this was just a little tiny catwalk, literally. I mean, it was maybe 3 feet wide with a railing. So women are not allowed down here. Like this stairway would not have existed when I went there in '97. But what happens is bar mitzvahs happen here all the time. You don't have the right to reserve a section. So it totally is a free-for-all. So if I come with my family and I've got a boy or a girl that's doing a bar mitzvah or a bar mitzvah, and if he's a boy, he can come in here, or we can do it outside at the outside wall, and we're going to do our ceremony while all the other stuff is going on, right? Or if you have a young woman who's doing a bar mitzvah, she would go over into the women's section, same kind of thing. You kind of push and shove a little bit. You're nice about it, but your family gets to. But nobody's going to stop doing what they're doing, right? You don't get like a layup. And if it's full, you just have to wait until somebody finally clears the spot. I mean, it's amazing. All right. So now we're in the Old City, and the Old City is both horizontal and vertical. So this is one of the layers, and obviously shops on the one side. And these gentlemen right here are Palestinian, and they happen to be Lutheran. We're not friends, but their dads are friends of mine. And almost all the Christians in the Old City are Lutheran. So there's a Jewish section, there's a Palestinian section, there's a Christian section in the Old City itself. And again, almost all the Christians are Lutheran. So if you want to dress, they can help you. If you want ancient artifacts, they can take care of you. So this is all newly discovered right before my first working trip as bishop. I had 2 trips as bishop that were just work, they weren't tours. But they believe this is Caiaphas's house, who was the chief priest. and that this has all been excavated. This would have all been covered in the time of Christ. And these steps over here were also discovered, and you'll see a picture of them in a second. They're fairly certain that this is, if you want to know where for sure Jesus walked, he would have walked there. But we think these are the prison cells that have been excavated. And that's really one of the reasons why they think this is Caiaphas's house. So here's some statuary outside about Peter's denial. The only thing they got wrong is Peter's probably too old. Yeah, he would more than likely would have, I mean, we think he's probably the oldest of the disciples, but more than likely would have been mid-20s, I would guess. He's certainly not an old man like he's depicted here. This is one of my favorite pictures. This is the old city at night. And normally there should be a cat. There's more dadgum Jerusalem cats. They're famous. So there we are with me standing on where Jesus walked. Is everyone getting dizzy? Okay. All right. So to be scripture, you need to have three things. It needs to be used in worship. The community that is holding it or utilizing it must make a decision that it's holy, that somehow God has been involved in the creation of it. And last but not least, I love the word sacrosanct, meaning it's sacred, and so it's now my responsibility to give it to you in a way that brings to the best of my ability the true meaning of the text, and that I don't get to change it. So if there's something in there that I don't like, or I would think that it's a lot better if it just had X or Y, once it becomes sacrosanct within the community, we need to just leave it the way it is. We don't get to do editing. All right? Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. So the Old Testament was in oral tradition with a few written pieces, certainly starting by 1400 BCE, before the time of Christ. There would be stories, obviously, that are prehistoric, that come down to us, aka the stories of creation. Those are told from generation to generation. We think some of the very first pieces to go into a written form are actually the Psalms. That King David wrote stuff, right? And he would have been important enough that he would have had enough horsepower to maintain those written texts. So, two things that happen historically that have deep impact on the community and on Scripture are the northern 10 tribes are overrun and taken into exile in the 700s. And the way they got rid of them, because they did get rid of them, is they let them live in family units, but the Assyrian Empire was big enough that they could take my family, gather us all up, and let us go live in Watertown. But they wouldn't let us go to Aberdeen. They wouldn't let us come back to Sioux Falls. And they would let us live our lives, and we could behave any way we wanted to behave. But over time, who are my children going to marry? Who are my grandchildren going to marry? How am I going to tell the stories? And it is the most amazing thing to watch as this group of people just disappear into history. And they disappear because they just were simply absorbed. Well, there was a National Geographic study back in the 70s or 80s as they started doing genetic work, and they went to see if they could find Jewish genetic markers up in that part of the world, and you could still find Jewish genetic markers there, but obviously no culture anymore. So at one point, then the same thing happens to the two remaining tribes. And they are living within the confined history of that experience of their sisters and brothers and cousins to the north. And so they ask for and receive the gift of being able to live in community. So when they're drug off into captivity in Babylon, they beg for and receive the offering of building their own community and being able to live in it, which is allowed. And truthfully, I think there's a high level of fear that's driving the bus. First and foremost, that God did not go with them because there was a strong belief that God was not going to leave the promised land. And so you see in all of the prophets this explanation and good news that God going too fast. And Larry, I'm picking on you, Larry. Larry, he's embarrassed. He doesn't want to hold up his hand and say, Rebbe, you need to back up there, dude. And then what's the reader's problem? Again, I'm going to be attentive to my students because I want to make sure they're not falling behind. I don't want them to rush in their writing. And again, I may lose my spot. And so I might miss a whole place, or I can have the same problem as before. I repeat. And then, of course, we have I won't pick on Larry, then we have the Dave Zelmer student whose mind wanders off and is not paying attention and gets bored because I'm pretty quick at writing and I'm waiting for the slow students. So what do? I doodle. We have great doodles. I'm not making this up. And sometimes the doodles, if there were words, get incorporated into the text. We're not talking about this in this class, but like in Romans 8:31 and following, I'm pretty sure that insert, because it doesn't fit, is somebody's doodle. Because what does it say? We are being killed all the day long. Does that not sound like a student, right? Our professor is just killing us here. I'm so sick and tired of this. All right. So when you're making a translation, this is what you do. The first part is called setting the text. So you go out, and this is now done worldwide, and it has been now for about the last 2 centuries. Obviously, it was a lot slower because you used to do this by mail. So you gather up world-class scholars from around the world, and I'll be nice to Larry since I was picking on him. Larry's our expert. He's the one that knows the most about the Gospel of Mark. So he gets to drive the Markan bus. So he'll say, I don't want Zelmer on my committee because he talks all the time. Or I do want Zelmer on my committee. So he gets to add the folks that he wants. And then word goes forth that we want every little piece we can get for the Gospel of Mark. And quite literally, you're going to get pieces like this. Right? This is what you're going to get back. Now, you're not going to get the piece, but they're going to take a picture of it just like this. You see the ruler alongside. If you want to get up and look, you can. And so all these pieces get put together. Some are obviously bigger. We have whole pages that are intact. So there will be attempts to date them. Because what? Older, all things being equal, is better than newer. Because the more centuries you have more copies to get you there, right? More opportunities for a mistake. So here is the oldest particle for this particular verse of John. And this is one that's pretty rare in that there's printing on both sides. Okay. So here, this is an early text, so early 1st century, and it's bound, and scripture is underneath, is behind this cover. Okay. All right. That's my kids, grandkids. It's like a whole herd, isn't it? Yikes. All right. So once you have the text, then they have an ongoing argument that might, and generally with scholars, you have to put a deadline on it, otherwise they'll just keep arguing. I've been around scholars before. They can argue about minutia, which they do. You want to establish the text before you even start translating. So this is in, this is out. This is clearly a repeat, so we don't need to put it in twice. Here's a hole, we need to fill it. How do we fill it? All of that takes place. And then once the whole committee and the chair are happy with the manuscript you have, then and only then do you start the work of translation. Now, generally what happens, this costs millions of dollars. I'm hoping you understand that. Because you literally are using scholars from all over the world. And now it's much quicker because we have the internet. But when the RSV, is anyone carrying an RSV today? That principal work was done in the 50s and 60s. And so that was all done with mail, every bit of it, and photocopies, and they wrecked some particles because they didn't know how to take care of stuff very well, so they took too bright of images. Yeah. And with the RSV, some of the big giant discoveries had not been fully incorporated. So the Library of Alexandria had not been fully incorporated into the Bible, and more importantly, the scrolls at Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls, had not been released. So that whole body of work was not available to that group of scholars. And then they make decisions about how we're going to translate. First and foremost is pronouns, because in Hebrew and Greek, almost every word is gendered. There are very, very few words that are not gendered. So almost everything is male or female, okay? And it's not necessarily the same in between Hebrew and Greek. So if you're working in one and not the other, you're fine. But if you're working back and forth, you need to be aware that gender might be different. Make sense? Okay. So for example, pairs of body parts, if you have two of them, are feminine in Hebrew, and singular are male in Hebrew. So if you want to be highly amused, that means that men's testicles are actually feminine, because we have two of them. So when I learned that, we all laughed, right, like you are right now. So it doesn't necessarily translate. And then again, there's huge pieces that simply don't exist in one language. So in Hebrew, you cannot talk about mind and body and soul. There is no way to have that conversation in Hebrew. You're just a person, period. It's only when you get to Greek that you can have that conversation. You can have that conversation in Latin. But truthfully, out of Semitic languages, Aramaic being the other one, you can't have that conversation. So you don't hear anyone talking about body, mind, and soul until you move into the Greek language. All right. Let's see. So then the other part that happens is, so how do we translate neutral? If there is no gender, or if it's like many, the RSV decision was, we're going to make that masculine. So all those places where you're talking about a group of people, no matter who's in the group, the decision had been made by the committee, the overarching committee, everything is going to be masculine. When they did the work for the NRSV, now the Dead Sea Scrolls, some of them are in, and pretty much all of the Library of Alexandria, Egypt, is in. So huge change in how we think about Scripture had happened, and now the decision is made that we're going to let, to the best of our ability, we're going to make the text say what the text says. So if it's just simply plural, we're going to use plural pronouns. We're not going to gender them. The other part that happens is because they want the text to speak as clearly as possible, to me, it ends up being kind of wooden. The translation is not always poetic. And they did it on purpose because they want you to hear to the best of their ability what the text was saying when it was in the Greek. Okay? That understandable? If you got questions, you got to raise your hand or throw something at me or whatever. I'm okay with questions. And I'm happy to have you disagree with me. You can just say, you are wrong. Okay? So now we get to Mark. Of the Synoptic Gospels, for sure it is the earliest. I believe it is the earliest of all the four Gospels. It was way before John. When I was at seminary, well, both my dad and I, when we were at seminaries, even though it was 20 plus years apart, we were taught that Mark was probably written in the early 40s, mid 40s at the latest. And as I've gone back to seminary through the decades, that's really changed. It's pushed way later now than it was when I was at school. Partly because of some of the information we've received from the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the only way we got the Dead Sea Scrolls, by the way, is somebody infiltrated the group because the Israelis wouldn't release it. And so here are scholars begging for this information all over the world, and they'd drop little tidbits out, right? So this guy, with malice aforethought, I'll find out his name by next week. He gets inside the Israeli archaeological group, makes copies of everything, and he knows he has just a moment, but he drops all the work on the internet and lets all the people that would want to know about that. And they can't get it back. So the information dumped out into the world. So again, we have this very early, fully intact copy of Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah, which is now very proudly displayed in the Temple of the Book in Jerusalem. There, in Jerusalem. And you can actually walk into the room with the spindle that's in the middle, and it's like 60 feet tall. And then you can walk all the way around the room, and here's the scroll of Isaiah unfolded, obviously kept in, hermetically sealed behind bulletproof glass and so on and so forth. Unbelievable. All right, so why does that matter? So what we've learned and what we can now see in the text is that there's some hints about the destruction of the temple that we didn't quite pick up on before when I was a student. We see them a little bit clearer because we've had some more archaeological discoveries about what actually happened when Jerusalem was sacked in 70 AD. And so there's these little tiny hints, and so that's kind of moved the text back. So you have to remember, here's the New Testament, right? So there are no Gospels then until we get, let's say, to 70, 71. That might be the first Gospel. So what's the Christian scripture before that? Well, we've got letters of Paul, are the drivers. And the problem with our New Testament is they made a decision to just simply put Paul's letters from biggest to smallest, which is not necessarily very helpful, because then people think that's the chronological order. Well, no, it's not the chronological order. Romans is without a doubt the oldest. No ifs, ands, buts about it, because you have this fully mature, he's been through all the battles, been through blah, blah, all the stuff. And he's now writing as a fully formed, and I use this word on purpose, Christian scholar. So if you want some of the new stuff, probably 1 Corinthians would have a pretty good argument, maybe Galatians. And then there's all kinds of things that we don't have we don't have any of the corresponding letters. Somebody wrote him from Corinth, right? More than once. We don't have any of those letters. Same thing with the church in Ephesus or all the other churches that he's writing to. We just simply don't have those pieces. So all we really have are Paul's letters. Same thing then with other pieces that clearly are written. Some we can't quite date. Hebrews gets run around all over the place. Sometimes it belongs to Paul, most of the time not. Because there's not a lot of things in it that can help you date it. All right? Let's see, what else do you need to know before we jump off? All right, so what do you suppose drives the bus for getting Gospels written? What would be the most glaring example? If they don't get written till 70, what's happening? If Jesus ascends into heaven somewhere between either 30 or 33 AD, there was a math error, by the way. So you've got what? You got almost 40 years. What's happening within the community?
Were they in hiding?
No.
Verbally spreading the gospel.
Oh, yep. There's one big giant driver that drove this whole thing. The eyewitnesses are dying. The people who actually walked around and talked with Jesus are either being executed by the Romans. We believe that 11 of the 12 disciples are executed. Certainly Paul is not included in that 11. We think the only one that dies of natural causes is John, and we think he was born on or about the same time as Christ, and that he died on or about 100 AD. But what's driving the bus is the eyewitnesses are dying, which means the storytellers are dying. All the stories that I've got because I hung out with Jesus. I got to walk with him. I got to listen to more than one sermon. Those are all in my head, right? And I tip over. I have a heart attack. All those stories are just now gone. So how do you capture stuff 40 plus, or in the case of Matthew or Luke, maybe 60, 70 years, or in the case of John, now maybe almost 180 years. So you got to get it on paper. And to the best of your ability, you need to be accurate. You don't want to be making stuff up. So if I've got an eyewitness, obviously they're going to have more precedent than the son or the daughter who didn't actually get to see Jesus or talk to Jesus, but just heard the story from mom or dad. Okay. And then, of course, what goes in? What gets left out? As John says, I'm paraphrasing, there's 1,000 things I could have written. 1,000 things. But I wrote these so that you might have faith. So I'm not going to write everything down. And that's certainly true in the Gospel of Mark. It's the shortest. And he clearly is primarily an oral storyteller. He is very, very comfortable in the oral tradition. He uses every technique that storytellers utilize in telling the story. I mean, when I read the first chapter of Mark, I'm exhausted by the time I get to the end of the first chapter because there's so many things that happen in the first chapter. It's like Mark comes out of the blocks, and he doesn't even really get much looked up down the track until you get to the end of chapter 1 and you've covered this vast array of material that's just coming at you at breakneck speed. So we go literally from birth to he's got disciples and, healing people and so on and so forth, all in the first chapter. Okay? So none of that's generated a question or a comment?
Was Mark Paul's thought student, or was that Luke?
That would be Luke's.
Luke. Okay.
So we think, I was in that meeting. What I've been taught, how about that? That would be more accurate. Is that Mark is the naked guy that you're going to see and is the son of the woman, obviously, which they stay in. They stay in their house with Peter. So there's conversation in Peter's letters about a woman who has a son named Mark, and that there's a deep relationship with that household. So go back and look in the letters of Peter, and there's a reference. But we think that Mark is Peter's student. Okay?
So he was a follower, but not a disciple. He was not one of the 12, but he was around Jesus first.
He would have been a boy and then a young man.
Yeah.
There's they go to grab him when they're in the garden, and he ends up naked, aka the first streaker recorded. We think that's Mark. Okay, so that's his one and only personal appearance in the gospel.